Hello, this video will help walk you through how to synthesize how to read literature or novels like a professor in the short story Winter Dreams. Before we can get into synthesizing these two pieces of text, you have to be able to comprehend the short story. Now, Fitzgerald likes to use a lot of vocabulary that we might not be completely familiar with, so please stop along the way and look up words that you are not sure what they mean. Use your context clues. If you're still not sure, then look it up and then revisit those context clues because sometimes these words have nuance and their true meaning is really dependent on the text that they're embedded in. Now that you've gained a basic comprehension of the words on the page, what I want you to do is take a few minutes, go through, just reread those first two paragraphs of the short story, and then try to find ways that you can synthesize those two paragraphs with the concepts that are in how to read literature like a professor, and then make notes on that chart. When you're done, continue with this video. So the first column on your chart is How to Read Literature, Chapter 2, Nice to Eat with You. So in this chapter, we're really focusing on times when the author writes about consumption, eating and drinking. Now for this particular passage, we don't see any mentions of eating and drinking, so I don't have anything in my chart. If there's something there that you found that you felt was consumption, just be prepared to defend your thinking. This next one, chapter 10, it's more than just rain or snow, does have some correlation to the first two paragraphs of our short story. So what I've done here is highlighted the different parts. We have the mention of the fall, the Minnesota winter, the snow, the long season, summer, the wind, and the sun. So when we see mentions of these different things in our passage, we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is the purpose here? So for this particular part, he's really focusing in on the winter and how it's not a very pleasant thing. Now, there is the mention of summer and sun, but it's really just to contrast against the harshness of the winter that he's describing. And although we don't live in Minnesota, I think we've all seen, like on the Weather Channel or on the news, how harsh a Minnesota winter can be. So that is the weather that he's trying to establish in our heads. Then we have to think about, okay, what might that mean? How might that be impacting our character, and how might that be impacting our setting and our mood? Chapter 11, More Than It's Going to Hurt You. This is really us looking for acts of violence, and we don't see anything here. We have some language that might lead us to think maybe that's something that's coming our way, but there isn't any act of violence per se. Chapter 12, Is That a Symbol? So this one is tricky because although we maybe can't pick out anything in these first two paragraphs that is a symbol, the reality is that sometimes we just need more context in our story. So once we read further and we get a better understanding of what's happening, we might actually be able to go back to these first two paragraphs and be like, okay, now that I've read more and I have a better understanding of what's happening here, I can go back and see that this actually was a symbol for something. And it's usually we can do that because we see little hints reoccurring, and then we can reflect back and find previous ones that we've missed. But as of right now, in the context that we have in just these two paragraphs, there's probably not anything that we can pick out as a symbol. This one, geography, and it goes along with the next one, which is You Can't Breathe Where the Air is Clear. Now, you might have some things in these two categories that overlap, look the same, or you're not quite sure which category to put it in. That is okay. It's less about knowing how to categorize this on that chart, and it's more about being able to pick these things out and have an idea of what they might mean. So we're going to focus in. You might have something a little bit different here, and that is absolutely fine, but let's just focus in on what I identified as geography. So they mentioned Sherry Island, Minnesota, and the country, in the hills. So when I think about those things, I have like a certain image in my mind of what they might mean. So when I think of island, I think of isolation. When I think of people who live on a place called Cherry Island, I think, oh wow, they seem wealthy, which is actually right here, right? That's actually supported. So maybe that's where that image came from in my head. Again, back to Minnesota, kind of harsh. I don't really associate islands with Minnesota, but that's obviously being on the lake. That's totally possible. When I think about country, I think about um, maybe a lack of sophistication, right or wrong, right? I grew up in the country, so I kind of have that personal bias, but I think of a lack of sophistication. I also think of isolation, much like being on an island. And then hills, when I think about just like physically what hills have peaks and they have valleys, they have high points and they have low points. So if that was intentional there, maybe the author is trying to give us some kind of clue there's going to be high points and low points in this character's story. So this one, we're looking at how the author takes this setting, which seems very real, but is actually fake, and makes it real for us. And this is often, can't remember who did this presentation, but I believe they talked about how you have to kind of drill down to the very like words, the like singular words that are used, because they really kind of create that setting in our brains. And this is where we have to tap into our visualization skills as well. We have to take these words and create that setting in our brain. That does not come naturally to everyone, and that is fine. Just like any skill, it's something that you have to practice. Sometimes you have to do it very consciously. You have to stop yourself and make yourself imagine, for example, a crisp and gray Minnesota winter, right? You have this big open field of snow. In my mind, that's how it looks to me, lacking color, lacking light. So try to create that same visualization in your brain. So we have that crisp and gray, snow that hit the fairways. Country gave him a feeling of profound melancholy. Now, I highlighted that entire thing because that description there, he's choosing to use words like melancholy. So that should start kind of putting a mood in our head. It should give us like a feeling of like what this feels like. The links should lie in enforced fallowness. And again, that word choice is very intentional. So that should start to create a certain feeling in us. On the tees where the gay colors fluttered in summer, there were now only the desolate sandboxes knee deep in crusted ice. So again, desolate, crusted ice. The hills the wind blew cold as misery, hard, dimensionless glare. So again, the author is giving us these words, very specifically chosen words to create this setting and create this picture in our head, but to also establish a feeling and a mood. This one, who's in charge here? So I've highlighted places where we have those clues. We have the pronouns here, him, he. It's referring to Dexter, as if this is not Dexter telling the story. So we know that this is third person. What form of third person it might be, we need to read a little bit more. Is this omniscient? Are we going to get into Dexter's head? Is it limited? Is it only from Dexter's point of view? So we have to read just a little bit more to kind of get an idea of what scope of third person this is, but we do know that it is third person. This one, The Light on Daisy's Dock, this is really about what is the character's desires and motivations, and we're just too early in the story to determine that. So I would not have anything in my chart for this one yet. And then finally, at the bottom of your page, there's a little section where it says questioning, connecting, predicting, visualizing, and inferring. So those are those active reading skills that I want you to always be engaged in when you're reading something. When you're reading for pleasure, you might just kind of naturally visualize. You might do some of these things very subtly in your brain, but when we're reading for class, we need to do them very consciously. We have to put effort and thought into doing these things. This really kind of differs from one person to the next, and that's kind of the purpose, right? Like, what do you bring to the story? What questions do you ask? What connections do you make? How do you visualize? For me personally, just to give you an example, I really focused on the visualization part for this because clearly the author is trying to create this setting that's very typical in the exposition of a story, right? In the beginning of a story, we're introduced to characters and setting to kind of set that stage. So I really kind of focused in on the visualizing part on my chart. So what I'd like you to do, I'm going to share a link with you with a copy of my chart for just these first two paragraphs. You kind of have an example of how I'd set that up. In my chart, I have the page number. I have like a little snippet of a quote, just so it's very easy for me to go back and find the part that I'm talking about. But I'll share that link out with you so you can see how I set up my chart. We will come back together soon and continue our discussion on the rest of this, and you will have time to work in a small group. So if you have some time, go ahead and take a quick break. Otherwise, I will see you back at the time that I gave you before you started.